August 6th, 1945 began as a normal day in Hiroshima, Japan. I mean, kind of. Of course, the country was embroiled in a deadly world war, and enemy forces, the United States specifically, had been bombing cities for months, unleashing firestorms that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. But if you could time travel to a Hiroshima sidewalk on the morning of August 6th, 1945, it would seem at least a little bit normal. At 8 a.m. that morning, the city was alive with the usual activity, the hustle and bustle of school drop-off, businessmen arriving for work at their respective office buildings, people walking their dogs, pushing babies in strollers, hailing taxis, a somewhat normal city sidewalk. At 8:15, all of that would change in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, that bustling Hiroshima street was engulfed in a blinding explosion that destroyed 5 square miles of the city, instantly killing an estimated 70 to 80,000 people, a number that would eventually near double due to exposure to radiation poisoning. That's around 40% of Hiroshima's population, killed with the pressing of a single button. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, the morning of August 6th, marked the first of 2 times that atomic bombs have been used as weapons in the history of our world, both times by the United States. But how did we get to that point, and why? These weren't soldiers. These weren't the men who bombed Pearl Harbor. These weren't the men who were raping and killing hundreds of thousands across China. These were innocent Japanese civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly. So, why? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and this is History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season and that the new year is treating you right so far, all 4 days of it, or 2 days if you're listening to this on Patreon. I very much enjoyed my week off last week, and I thank you sincerely to all those who delved into the bonus content on Patreon in my absence. There's always so much there to hold you over until the next episode comes out. Tons and tons of mini fixes and bonus content and things like that. I'm back on Japan this week. This turned into an unintended 3-parter, I think. Back in early December 7th, actually, the anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, we talked about that attack with the help of expert Quinn Cho and how the U.S. got involved in World War II after Pearl Harbor. And then that sort of naturally led to an episode about Japanese-American internment camps during the war. So we sort of talked about how it started and how it went, and I feel like I'd be leaving you hanging if we don't talk about how it ended. So today's episode is about that ending, and it went out with a bang, for sure. A bang that has raised many, many moral and ethical questions ever since. A bang that still very much looms over us today and going forward into the future. So, seems a worthy topic. To really understand what happened in Hiroshima, Japan on August 6, 1945, we have to get a little bit sciencey. I touched on some of this already in a mini-fix that I did, mini-fix number 17 about Marie Curie. You can listen to that one on Patreon, always linked in the description. That would be a great accoutrement to this episode, actually. But basically, atomic bombs work because of nuclear fission, which is the splitting of the nucleus of an atom, hence the term atomic. So you split the nucleus of an atom, of an unstable element. It can't just be like any old atom. It has to be of an unstable element like uranium or plutonium. And once that nucleus splits, it releases neutrons that cause the other neighboring nuclei to also split. So it triggers basically a chain reaction. All these nuclei splitting and releasing an immense amount of energy, heat, pressure, radiation, in the form of an explosion. That's basically what an explosion is, after all, right? So the discovery of it all began with a German scientist named Martin Klaproth in 1789. He's the one who discovered uranium. Lots of nerds in this episode. Get ready for the names of lots of nerds. And if you know me, you know that nerd is a term of endearment. I want like baseball cards of these guys. Nerd cards. That's how cool they are to me. Now, much later, 1896, so over 100 years later, a French physicist named Henri Becquerel discovered that uranium gave off radiation. Okay, so Klaproth back in the 1780s, he discovered uranium, but he didn't really know what he had found. Becquerel discovers that it gives off radiation. And this discovery piqued the interest of Marie Curie, who was a Polish physicist and chemist working in France. And it was Marie who actually coined the term radioactive. She studied uranium extensively and actually, along with her husband Pierre, discovered additional radioactive elements in the process, polonium and radium. She's one of, if not the most badass female scientists in the world has ever seen. Minifix number 17, truly do check that one out. It's pretty awesome. So what does radioactive mean, though, right? It means that the atoms are unstable. Like I said, they come apart, they disintegrate, and they release electromagnetic particles. Marie Curie's work with radioactivity changed everything we thought we knew about atoms, which means that it changed everything we thought we knew about physics, which is literally everything. It led to our understanding of atoms as a nucleus, right, with protons and neutrons in the middle, surrounded by electrons. Before this, we thought atoms were made of like one indivisible particle. They were just one little thing. They didn't have other parts in them. We didn't know that they were made of these subatomic particles that could be separated out, causing things to happen. Marie Curie gave us that knowledge. Now, by the 1930s, other nerds were experimenting with this concept of separating subatomic particles. What happens if we take a neutron, right, out of the middle of an atom? What happens? And one of these guys was a Hungarian-German physicist named Leo Szilard. Szilard came up with the concept, the theory, the idea of nuclear fission reactions, where one neutron splits off and then causes this chain reaction of neutron splitting. He came up with that idea in 1933. The next year, an Italian physicist named Enrico Fermi accidentally pulled this off. He unknowingly split uranium neutrons while conducting some experiments. So then, piggybacking off all that, the theory and the accidental execution, Austrian-Swedish female physicist, woot, Lisa Meitner, together with a German chemist named Otto Hahn, actually did this whole nuclear fission thing successfully and on purpose. Now, you may be thinking, okay, we got German nerds, we got French nerds, Polish nerds, Italian nerds, Hungarian nerds, Austrian nerds. This is like a joint effort here. But all of this is happening in Europe. These are all European nationalities. How did it get to the United States? How was the U.S. the one to actually make use of this new discovery? Well, around this same time, in the 1930s, things were really ramping up in Nazi Germany. Anti-Semitism was growing in Germany and also in Italy as fascist regimes gained power in both places. This began to force some of these scientists out of those countries, specifically Leo Szilard, who was Jewish and living in Germany. Not a great place to be for a Jewish person in the 1930s. Enrico Fermi, whose wife, Lara Capon, was Jewish, and they were living in Italy. So Szilard and Fermi both fled their respective countries to the United States. Lisa Meitner was also Jewish, and she fled Austria, but she went to Sweden, not the U.S. Now, Otto Hahn, who worked with Meitner to actually pull off nuclear fission, he stayed in Germany. Okay, we'll come back to that. But a lot of these other guys were fleeing these anti-Semitic fascist regimes. Over in the U.S., Szilard teams up with a guy named Walter Zenn. They recreate Meitner and Hahn's nuclear fission experiment. Of that moment, that successful experiment, Szilard said, quote, "That night, there was very little doubt in my mind that the world was headed for grief," end quote. He gets together with Fermi, these two refugees, really. They team up, and they start building a nuclear reactor at Columbia University. And just the irony of that, you guys, these scientists, these brilliant, groundbreaking scientists have been forced out of their countries by governments who see themselves as the superior race and who are prepared to annihilate them in mass genocide, right? The final solution. Meanwhile, these guys, these refugees hold the knowledge, the power to literally destroy the entire world. Underestimation is an understatement here. Another refugee, a Jewish German theoretical physicist, had also fled Europe and was living on Long Island, New York. And you've definitely heard of him, Albert Einstein. Szilard goes to Einstein and they talk about nuclear fission and its devastating potential. Together, they write a letter to U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, on August 2nd, 1939. In it, they say, quote, "This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed," end quote. This is a warning to the leader of this country that has taken them in. They're saying basically, hey, we're kind of in this niche group of nerds who know about this, but we think you should know that we've developed a technology that could obliterate everything. Just thought you might want to know that. And this is a problem because remember Otto Hahn, the first guy to actually pull off nuclear fission along with Meitner? He's still in Germany. He has this knowledge and he's German. He's chilling in his lab over in Nazi Germany, just sitting on this world-destroying bit of knowledge with an actual madman running the country. So yeah, FDR was interested, right? He was definitely interested. He forms the Advisory Committee on Uranium in October of 1939. As anything science or really education-related tends to do, this committee moved very slowly at first. It wasn't until after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, so over 2 years later, that they started to get serious. The U.S. was officially in World War II, right? We got to get this whole uranium, nuclear fission, new type of bomb thing figured out before someone else does. Once this ramps up, the Army Corps of Engineers takes over the task of actually trying to make an atomic bomb. In August of 1942, they created the Manhattan Engineer District, which was named after their offices in Manhattan in New York City. And this is where the codename Manhattan Project would later be derived. A guy named Colonel Leslie R. Groves was put in charge of this project. Okay, so Groves was an Army guy. He was a brigadier general. He was not a scientist. He's kind of like the project manager. But he needs an actual scientist if he's going to build and test atomic bombs, right? That's kind of a requirement. Nerds only, please. Now, Szilard and Fermi are still hard at work on this. On December 2nd, 1942, they were able to produce a self-sustaining nuclear reaction strong enough to power a light bulb. I know that seems kind of minor, but it was actually a really big deal because it was the first instance in history of a self-sustaining nuclear reaction. Proof, really, that the theory was even possible. And this was done actually beneath the squash courts at the University of Chicago, according to the National World War II Museum. Later that month, later in December, after Szilard and Fermi pulled this off, the Manhattan Project exploded into this massive undertaking. They had over 30 project sites all over the country and over 100,000 people working on this project at an eventual cost of around $2.2 billion. A massive undertaking, but at the same time, top secret. They don't want enemy countries finding out what they're doing, so this whole thing had to be a secret. Pretty terrifying that we're able to pull off secret projects of this magnitude. So Szilard and Fermi are doing their thing, but Groves still needs like a head nerd. He needs a nerd in charge of all of this if they're actually going to be successful at building this bomb. And he selects a nerd by the name of J. Robert Oppenheimer to head the secret weapons laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, which was like the center of operations. Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist and a physics professor at the University of California, Berkeley. I love this. Same thing I talked about in episode 25 about the Apollo 13 near disaster when they call in the teachers. They're like literally like middle of the night. They're on the phone with these professors from all over, just like, help us. What do we do? Help us save these guys. Who has the knowledge to save the world? To destroy the world even? It's the teachers. It's the teachers, you guys. So Oppenheimer leaves his classroom at Berkeley and he goes to Los Alamos to build the first atomic bomb. They figure out you can make bombs out of uranium and you can also make them out of plutonium, which is another radioactive element, but it isn't naturally occurring. It's actually a byproduct that comes from uranium reactions. So in experimenting with uranium, they actually discovered plutonium, which works arguably better for creating bombs. It's even more radioactive than uranium is. So Oppenheimer decides to use plutonium for this first attempt at a bomb. He makes the bomb. He's like, now we have to test it. Groves doesn't want to test it because plutonium is seriously expensive and rare, but Oppenheimer insists, and he's the guy who knows, so they move forward with plans to test the bomb. This was called the Trinity test, and that name was inspired by the writing of a 17th century poet named John Donne. Oppenheimer had been reading Donne's sonnets, his donnets, if you will, before the test, and he was struck by the line, quote, "Batter my heart, three-personed God." So he's a bit of a poetic nerd. Anyway, this test took place at Alamogordo, New Mexico, around 200 miles south of the research laboratory at Los Alamos. The bomb they were testing was nicknamed Gadget, and it was made of some 13 pounds of plutonium. At 5:29 a.m., on the morning of July 16, 1945, the Trinity test began. They hoisted Gadget, the bomb, into the air using a steel tower and suspended it 100 feet above the ground. Then they used an implosion method to detonate it. The result was expected and yet unexpected. It exploded, but on a much larger scale than they thought it would. Oppenheimer had been expecting an explosion equivalent to 300 tons of TNT. What they got instead was an explosion equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. The bomb was 70 times stronger than they thought it would be. According to the National World War II Museum, quote, "The flash from the bomb was so bright that it temporarily blinded observers standing 10,000 yards away. The heat from the bomb was so intense that it evaporated the steel tower, left a crater 5 feet deep by 30 feet wide, and melted the sand in the area, creating a mildly radioactive green glass called trinitite." Upon witnessing the blast, Oppenheimer famously uttered a line from the Bhagavad Gita, quote within a quote, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," end quote. Oppenheimer also said of that moment, quote, "We waited until the blast had passed, walked out of the shelter, and then it was entirely solemn. We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent," end quote. Now, for some context, so that happened July 16, 1945. They successfully tested the first atomic bomb. What's happening with the war at this point? Well, Germany had already surrendered back in May. The European front of World War II is over, has been over for a couple of months. Hitler is dead. FDR is also dead. Actually, FDR died on April 12th of a cerebral hemorrhage, which is a type of stroke. He collapsed while sitting for a portrait, having his portrait made, and never regained consciousness. That portrait remains unfinished. You're seeing it now if you're watching the video version of this on YouTube or Patreon. So FDR died April 12th. Hitler committed suicide April 30th. Then Germany surrendered May 9th. and the first atomic bomb was tested July 16th. Now, you may be thinking, everybody's dead. The war's over. Why are we even still messing with the bomb at this point? Well, it's not over in the Pacific. FDR died in office, so his vice president, Harry S. Truman, took over as president of the United States and inherited a war with Japan that was worse than ever and not going anywhere despite victory in Europe. So the Trinity test of this first atomic bomb was successful. Groves calls up President Truman and he tells him, we did it. In fact, it's even more powerful than we thought. And the timing of this is really perfect because when Truman gets this news, he's already at the Potsdam Conference. So this was a meeting between the US, the Soviet Union, and the UK, the three leading Allied forces during the war, to try to figure out what to do next. Germany had surrendered, but how do we move forward? And what about Japan? So at this conference, the Potsdam Declaration was written, and this called for Japan's unconditional surrender. Truman basically goes, in a matter of words, he goes, surrender or we'll destroy you. We have the technology and we will use it. Prompt and utter destruction were his actual words. Japan refuses. Now, let's talk a little more about what's been going on with Japan. Since about 1944, so like a year ago, it's been pretty obvious that Japan cannot win this war. It's just not going to happen. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the resources. It is unwinnable for Japan. But despite this, instead of giving up, they resolved to fight until the bitter end, to go down swinging. Between just April and July of 1945, so 3 months, Japanese forces killed so many Allied troops that it was equal to roughly half of those who died throughout the last 3 whole years of war in the Pacific. So they're really digging their heels in. And for what? It's obvious they're going to lose. So all this loss of life at this point is just pointless. But the Allies cannot get Japan to surrender. They are forced to resort to extreme measures in the form of brutal attacks on Japanese civilians. So when we think about the bombing of civilians during World War II, we usually think about the Blitz, right? Germany bombing London. And it's terrible. Why would they do that? These are innocent people. They're killing children. But you guys, what the U.S. did in Japan is way worse than what the Nazis did to London. I don't think many people even know about this. And I'm not even talking about the atomic bombs. I know people know about that. I'm talking about all the bombing they did before they dropped the atomic bombs, which was arguably worse than the atomic bombs. Okay, so hear me out because this was news to me, so it might be news to you too. So the U.S. was desperate to get Japan to surrender. They have to do something to force it to happen. In Europe, one of the strategies over there was the bombing of military and industrial sites, factories and whatnot, to try to cripple the infrastructure. They try this in Japan too, but it doesn't work. Okay, so it's set up differently in Japan. There aren't like big factories set off by themselves like in Europe. The industry in Japan is in the form of small workshops that are integrated into residential areas. So the focus shifts from bombing big factories set off by themselves like in Europe to just bombing the urban areas themselves. And this, of course, meant a whole lot more civilian casualties. The Blitz, when Germany bombed London between September of 1940 and May of 1941, killed an estimated 43,000 people over a period of 8 months. Japan was next level. One night of bombing Tokyo in March of 1945 killed 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. This is worse as far as immediate casualties than what the atomic bomb did to Hiroshima. And I don't think anyone even really knows about it. The single deadliest air raid in history. Once the Allies realized the bombing of factories and military outposts wasn't going to work like it had in Europe, and they committed to the bombing of urban areas to try to force a surrender in Japan, it gets really bad. They actually built full-scale replicas of Japanese homes out in the American West and then tested the best way to destroy them. Okay, so you can't really hide the fact that the civilians were being targeted. They were building homes to test destruction on. Turned out, Japanese-style houses burned very easily, and so the strategy became firebombing. This type of attack uses incendiary bombs, which start fires. Richard Overy, author of Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan, says in an article for History Extra, quote, "Within 5 months, they destroyed 60% of Japan's urban area. They killed 250,000 Japanese people, the overwhelming majority women, children, and old people. 10 million fled to the countryside, but it became difficult to feed them." End quote. But despite all of this, 100,000 civilians killed in a single night, Japan will not surrender. Truman hits them up at the end of July after the Trinity test of the first atomic bomb was successful, right? He goes, "Will you surrender now? If not, we're going to do this thing." And they still won't. So now what? We're actually going to drop an atomic bomb on Japan? This wasn't universally accepted as an idea, of course. Many wanted to carry on with the firebombing that was already happening. General Douglas MacArthur proposed following that up with a massive invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. But when MacArthur told Truman that that invasion would likely result in the deaths of up to 1 million U.S. troops, Truman shut it down. And honestly, I can't blame him. 1 million U.S. soldiers dead? And for what? Japan's going to lose anyway. What are we still fighting for? It all seems like such a waste. So it's just this really difficult, desperate situation that they're in. And, desperate times call for desperate measures. Are we going to kill 100,000 Japanese civilians? Or are we going to let them kill 1 million U.S. soldiers? That's an impossible question. Many were morally opposed, including Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as well as many of the actual scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project. In the end, it was determined that atomic bombing Japan was necessary. It would not only end the war, for sure, it would also put the U.S. in a dominant global position after the war. The city of Hiroshima was bombed first on August 6th. A 9,000-pound uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was dropped from a plane at about 8:15 in the morning and exploded 2,000 feet above the city with the force of 15,000 tons of explosives, destroying 5 square miles and killing 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly. Amazingly, after this, Japan still did not surrender. And so, another bomb was dropped, this time on the city of Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, so 3 days later. This bomb was actually meant for a city called Kokura, but there were thick clouds over Kokura that day, and so the plane carried on to the next city on the list instead, which happened to be Nagasaki. This bomb was called Fat Man. It was a 10,000-pound plutonium bomb that should have had the power of 22,000 tons of explosives. So it was even more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima at just 15,000 tons. But because of the topography of Nagasaki, which is settled in a valley between mountains, it limited the damage of the bomb to just 2.5 square miles and kept the initial deaths at about 40,000. So pretty much half as much damage as in Hiroshima, despite being a stronger bomb. On August 15th, 6 days later, Emperor Hirohito of Japan surrendered in a radio broadcast. And so, their plan had worked, but at what cost? According to History.com, quote, "Because of the extent of the devastation and chaos, including the fact that much of the two cities' infrastructure was wiped out, exact death tolls from the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain unknown. However, it's estimated roughly 70,000 to 135,000 people died in Hiroshima and 60,000 to 80,000 people died in Nagasaki, both from acute exposure to the blasts and from long-term side effects of radiation, end quote. But there was another type of cost, too. There was the loss of life, and some probably justified that by saying, well, look, it was still way less than the 1 million U.S. troops who would have died if we had gone with the other plan. But there was also the cost of unleashing that technology on the world, making it a thing. Now, atomic bombs are a possibility. That can happen. And for the next 40-some years, we were absolutely crippled by the fear of this happening. The Cold War with the Soviet Union. Just the irony of creating this thing, unleashing this thing on the world, and then trying to be like, oh, but wait, don't use it on us. Like, what did you think was going to happen? But I stumbled upon a letter written from a father to his son that I think is very interesting. And it sheds some light on an alternate idea about what might happen after a bomb like this is unleashed. This letter was written by Luis Alvarez, a physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project. So this guy helped to develop the bombs that were dropped on Japan. But more than that even, he was sent along in one of 3 airplanes that dropped that first bomb on Hiroshima as a scientific observer. Because once again, we're not trusting soldiers with this kind of advanced scientific technology, right? We got to have at least one nerd there. Well, Luis Alvarez was that nerd. He was in one of the planes when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and he wrote this letter to his 5-year-old son, Walter, on the return flight home.
Dear Walter, this is the first grown-up letter I've ever written to you, and it is really for you to read when you are older. During the last few hours, I have been thinking of you and your mother and our little sister Jean. It was tough to take off on this flight, not knowing whether I would ever see any of you again. But lots of other fathers have been in the same spot many times before, in this war, and I had a job to do, so I can't claim to be any sort of hero. I wonder if you will remember the time in Albuquerque when we climbed all through a B-29 superfortress. Probably you will remember climbing through the tunnel over the bomb bay, as that really impressed you at the time. Well, I've been in this B-29 for 8 hours so far, and we won't be back for another 5 or 6. The story of our mission will probably be well known to everyone by the time you read this, but at the moment, only the crews of our 3 B-29s and the unfortunate residents of the Hiroshima district in Japan are aware of what has happened to aerial warfare. Last week, the 20th Air Force, stationed in the Marianas Islands, put over the biggest bombing raid in history with 6,000 tons of bombs, about 3,000 tons of high explosive. Today, the lead plane of our little formation dropped a single bomb, which probably exploded with the force of 15,000 tons of high explosive. That means that the days of large bombing raids with several hundred planes are finished. A single plane disguised as a friendly transport can now wipe out a city. That means to me that nations will have to get along together in a friendly fashion, or suffer the consequences of sudden sneak attacks which can cripple them overnight. What regrets I have about being a party to killing and maiming thousands of Japanese civilians this morning are tempered, with the hope that this terrible weapon we have created may bring the countries of the world together and prevent future wars. Alfred Nobel thought that his invention of high explosives would have that effect, by making wars much too terrible. But unfortunately, it had just the opposite reaction. Our new destructive force is so many thousands of times worse that it may realize Nobel's dream.
I find it interesting that the first thing Alvarez does after witnessing the instantaneous deaths of at least 70,000 innocent people with the use of technology that he helped create is to write a letter to his then 5-year-old son. He wrote the letter in the airplane on the way back after dropping the bomb. That's strange to me. There's a lot to unpack there. He doesn't write it to the President of the United States. He doesn't write to Oppenheimer or his colleagues who worked with him on the Manhattan Project. He doesn't write to his wife. He writes to his 5-year-old son, to a child who now has to live in a world forever changed. changed. He writes a letter to the future, and in it, he convinces himself that what he has done is for the best, that now the countries of the world will have to get along. Now, the consequences are too great. The mere threat of this bomb will keep people in line. But he even admits it's the same thing Alfred Nobel thought when he invented high explosives, and he was wrong. Our new destructive force is so many thousands of times worse that it may realize Nobel's dream, he wrote. There's a lot hinging on that word may, isn't there? To date, the United States remains the only country to ever weaponize atomic bombs, despite very real fears throughout the Cold War from 1947 to 1991. Because of his father's work, little Walter Alvarez would have regularly practiced atomic bomb drills at school known as duck and cover drills, where students got under their desks and covered their heads with their arms to shield themselves from the blast. I found a 10-minute-long instructional video about the duck and cover drill that they used to show to school children. I'll link it in the description. It's pretty surreal. Here's a little preview.
Older people will help us as they always do, but there might not be any grown-ups around when the bomb explodes. Then, you're on your own.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash? Duck and cover. Duck and cover. Duck and cover.
This would have done absolutely nothing in the event of an actual atomic bomb, of course. Fun side note, I stumbled upon this and I can't figure out how to work it in, so I'm just going to interject it real quick. Walter Alvarez grew up to be a scientist as well, and he and his father Louis, the guy who wrote the letter, together they came up with the theory that the dinosaurs went extinct because of an asteroid impact, which is still the widely held belief today. Unrelated, but interesting. But while Walter's growing up doing these duck and cover drills at school, there never were any atomic bombs dropped during the Cold War. There were no bombs of any kind dropped, actually. No large-scale fighting at all, no actual fighting. That's why it's cold. And it seems that fear of nuclear warfare, was the deterrent that did indeed keep both sides in line. No one wanted to attack the other for fear of atomic bomb retribution. And so maybe Luis Alvarez was onto something. Maybe he wasn't just rambling, trying to make himself feel better about what he had done. Maybe the atomic bomb really did realize Nobel's dream. There really was a level of war too horrible for us to cross into. We've never been back there, and hopefully, we never will. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.